Hey friends, and welcome back to another episode of Built by Us, a video series made of, by, and for the people. If you've heard of Built by Us, that's because it spawned from our incredible podcast, so be sure to check out the Built by Us podcast anywhere you stream or listen. Today we're going to be talking about protecting our votes, and I have an incredible guest with me, Carol Moreno Cifuentes, who is our policy and program manager here at Democracy NC. Carol hails from the Pacific Northwest, where she graduated Oregon State University with a degree in political science. She's worked with groups such as the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services for Tribal Affairs and Policy Office, and helped develop policies to hold law enforcement accountable for the use of surveillance tech through the Urban Leaders Fellowship in Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. Hey, Carol.
Hi, Giselle.
Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about protecting our vote. It is the election cycle. There's a lot going on, and we just want to let our viewers know the ways that Democracy North Carolina is helping ensure that their vote is protected during the general election. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, so we're trying to make sure that every eligible voter can cast their ballot freely this election. So what that means is we really do start before the election period even kicks off through our County Board of Elections advocacy program. And what that means is we're working year-round to build relationships with our local county officials to ensure that we can advocate for more funding for elections, because we know that ensures greater voter access, and so we can make sure that voters have as many early voting options as possible. We've found that advocacy is incredibly useful for making sure that predominantly Black and Brown voters have access where they need. And we also work with those board election officials to think about other ways to improve the voting process. And so that's just one part of protecting the vote that starts way before we're even getting to the general election. But the other part is through our Vote Protector poll monitoring program. And so the Vote Protector program sends out several volunteers across the state to early voting sites and on election day to provide voters answers to commonly asked questions and to make sure that they're connected to our statewide voter hotline, which is the third thing that we're doing to protect the vote. And so those vote protectors are a really great resource. They put out signs to connect voters to the hotline. They answer those questions. And then of course our hotline volunteers are really like that wide shop for all questions pertaining to voting.
That's awesome. So it seems like there's a robust kind of network of election protection happening here in Democracy, North Carolina, and across the state. You mentioned that the work doesn't just start on election day or during election season. It's like a year-long process. What do some of like the policies or the things that y'all do specifically during the year that helps make sure now our elections are safe?
Yeah, so one of those things is working with the State Board of Elections on guidances that are being provided to county boards based on our monitoring efforts. So when we're hearing from election officials that are saying, hey, we're lacking resources to adequately staff our voting sites with poll workers, or we're lacking funding to retain our election directors, being able to talk to the State Board of Elections about what support they can provide the counties is really essential, or being able to give them feedback on how their guidances have maybe caused confusion in the past to election officials, or how it can be improved. And so keeping that relationship positive has been really useful for improving some of the language and the resources that we're really pushing to have out there for voters.
Yeah, it costs money.
Yeah, it does cost money. Everything.
It costs money to run safe and accessible elections. And I know if we look at the previous years in the election cycles, you know, and the state budget process here in North Carolina, it's been a bit contentious. The state budget process has been one of those things where it's often been done behind closed doors in the middle of the night, and appropriate government functions aren't getting the money that they're asking for. So when you put it that way, like, okay, the money is coming from the state, but where is it going? To helping pay workers, or help make sure we have the right tech, or make sure that we have the right amount of pens and stuff like that. You can see how it really matters and trickles down to ensure that our elections are safe and accessible.
Definitely.
And Tell us, our viewers, a little bit today about like what the hotline does, because you might have heard about 888-our-VOTE, which is the voter assistance hotline that is available to all 100 counties. So it doesn't matter where you live in North Carolina, you can call or text the hotline, and a qualified election lawyer or expert will be able to answer your questions. Like, tell us a little bit more about like what the hotline does and like what's the types of questions that you answer.
Yeah, so those teams of attorneys that are answering questions when we're receiving calls have really been trained on North Carolina election law, and some of them have even worked previously on cases that have introduced what our laws look like here. And so some of the common questions we often get from voters will be, where is my early voting site? How can I find that information? How can I find information about the candidates? How can I check my voter registration status? Those are some general questions we have, but we also speak to voters that are in tricky situations where maybe they recently moved to North Carolina and they're not quite sure if they meet the residency requirements, and they're not quite sure where to vote in the election or how to even register. I know when I moved to North Carolina, I was coming from Oregon, which is a voting by mail state, and had a lot of confusion about where the drop boxes were. And news to me, there are none here. So those are the types of voters we're talking to. A lot of voters that really might just be coming even out of the incarceration system and are trying to learn more information about what their voting rights are. So that's why it's so helpful to have attorneys that can answer some of those more complicated issues. But I do find that one of the most common questions we get is around that registration question. And that's why the statewide voter lookup tool is so useful, and we really do try to serve as that resource and container for making sure that we can check on that voter status and that they have everything they need before they show up to vote.
That's great. And the lookup tool that Carol's referencing, you can access that at ncvoter.org/lookup. You're able to look up your specific sample ballot and your information about if you're registered to vote, where, and how. So tell us a little bit, okay, so you've told us a little bit about our vote protectors, which are vote protectors that go out in yellow shirts. I wore yellow today.
Yeah.
And they're stationed at the polling locations. They're there with clipboards and the hotline number on their t-shirt. So if you show up and you've got questions, or you are turned away potentially, or you're not given an exception form, let's say you don't have your ID, those poll monitors, those vote protectors help those voters. There's also the hotline that you just talked about. So if you have any questions, you can call 888-our-VOTE or text 888-687-8683 and text any questions that you have, and you'll get a response from a certified election expert or lawyer. Okay, so that's like up until Election Day. How do we protect votes after Election Day?
That's a great question. So it used to be the case that we would say our work ends on Election Day. That is not the case and hasn't been for a long time, because we do know that after Election Day, the ballot counting process is occurring. So that is known as the canvass period, pre-canvass period, where County Board of Election members meet and they review ballots. And if a voter cast a provisional ballot, which is a type of ballot that someone might be given if there's a question about their eligibility, that's when they'll determine and investigate what that voter's eligibility status is. So during that period, our election advocates, our monitors, do go to meetings all across the state to document what conversations are being held, what practices county boards are issuing in that period. And we also recruit legal canvass monitors that are a huge player in ensuring that the process is being followed. Just last year, our own policy director, Caitlin Kaiser, was in one of those Board of Election meetings during the ballot counting process, and there was some confusion about how to properly count a specific type of absentee ballot, and she was able to read the guidance from the state board and to share her knowledge, and that made sure that that ballot was being counted. So that's just one bucket of work that can be continued that's so essential. And that data has also allowed us to really come back to the legislature with more information about this is how this process is happening in practice and some of the problems that we were seeing. But another component of it is what we refer to as ballot cure, which is just fixing your ballot. So let's say you show up to the polls and you realize you forgot your photo ID. But you didn't complete an ID exception form. You chose to just cast that provisional and come back another day with that photo ID. That's a form of cure of fixing that ballot. And so one thing we do is contact those voters to try to make corrections.
That's great. That's awesome. And I think that like you are touching on some really great points, because as we've seen from the 2020 election, where there was contention around the ballot counting process and certain folks thinking that they won the election and other folks recognizing that actually factually this candidate won the election. I think what we're being mindful of as that election denial has grown in certain arenas, that certifying and counting your ballot is something that's been done for a really long time. There are safeguards and processes in place to make sure your ballot is counted, just like you explained. And it really depends, it really matters that folks like us, everyday people, are potentially attending those meetings to make sure that those checks and balances are happening, and if there is guidance that needs to be looked at, like Caitlin, you said, that those election officials are utilizing every bit of resource they can to make sure their ballot counts, or that person's ballot counts.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say about that is that during the ballot counting process, a lot of folks don't realize this, but each of your counties have a board of elections that is composed of 2 members of the Republican Party and 2 members of the Democrat Party and a chair. And so when that ballot counting process is happening, there has to be an equal amount of members of both parties present when reviewing some of those ballots. And so that's one way we ensure that there's fairness and that there's accuracy when that process is occurring, among other safeguards. So I agree, being at those meetings is just one way to really spread the word about what you saw in the room, what that looked like, what your experience was.
Yeah, that's great. And you can sign up if you're interested in attending your county canvass meeting after Election Day. You can sign up at demnc.co/canvass to learn more about the canvass monitoring program that Carol helps host for our organization. So tell our viewers a little bit more about like when the final results of the election actually happen.
Yeah, so the county canvass happens 10 days after Election Day, but something people will probably see on Election Day is a preliminary count or announcement of election results. That is not the final result. Like I was saying earlier, during that period, county board members are working tirelessly to research those provisional ballots to figure out which voters will be able to have their ballots either partially or fully counted. And in some smaller counties, those provisional ballots can really make a difference in some races, and voters that are going back and making corrections can really make a difference in races. And so just know that if you're seeing those numbers out there, the county canvass is really that point where those results will be sent out to the State Board of Elections, and then the State Board of Elections will certify the results.
And what is a provisional ballot?
A provisional ballot is a ballot that's cast when there's a question about a voter's eligibility status. So that could be if they didn't show up on the voter rolls for some reason, if they voted at the wrong polling precinct. There can be a lot of reasons to cast a provisional.
And I think we might see a bit more provisional ballots this cycle due to the devastation that has happened in the West. Particularly Hurricane Helene is impacting over 25 counties in western North Carolina, where those folks might not have a voter ID, or they might have another issue that could be a barrier for them to be able to register to vote or access the ballot. And so could we potentially see more provisional ballots this year?
I think that's correct. And I think another pool of voters will be voters that might have issues in presenting their photo ID. And that might not be a result of not having one. It might just be forgetting it at home, not realizing there was a change. And we know that the majority of voters who decide that they'll actually come back another day to present their photo ID end up not doing that. It is a burden for them to travel back to a voting site, especially if they wait until Election Day and then it might change. So that's just one other pool that I think will add to the number of provisionals this year.
Yeah, this election cycle is the first election cycle in North Carolina where we will have voter ID. So be sure that you've got a voter ID that's up to date and eligible to cast your ballot this November. What are some of the eligible identifications that folks can use?
So you can obviously use your North Carolina driver's license. You could use your passport. If you are a veteran or a member in the military, you could use that ID card. If you are a student and your college went through the process of getting their student ID approved through the state board, then your IDs would be on a list and you'd be able to use your student ID. So a lot of options out there for folks.
Awesome, that's great. Any other tips and tricks that you can let our folks know that, as they're heading to the polls this election?
I would just emphasize, check your voter registration status online. Make sure that your address is current. If you recently moved out of your county, you do need to update your voter registration, and we do offer in North Carolina same-day voter registration. So if you miss that deadline of registering ahead of early voting, you can.
That's today.
Which is today, yes.
So by the time this comes out, we are in early voting.
Yes. And so once you've missed that, just know same-day voter registration is an option. You do have to show up with some documentation providing proof of residency, and you can find some more information about that on our resources as well. But just that's the most common reason why people have trouble voting is just not having their registration up to date.
Yeah, and you can check out your registration at ncvoter.org/register and see if you're up to date with your registration, if you need to utilize same-day registration at an early voting location, and you can check to see where your polling locations are in your county. Well, thanks so much, Carol, for joining us today. Any last words to our viewers as they head out to the polls?
If you have any problems, call 888-RVOTE.
That's right. Check out the hotline. It is 888-RVOTE. You can call, you can text. That number is 888-687-8683. You can also go to ncvoter.org for all of the latest information about your elections in your county, checking out your sample ballot. We also have a ballot builder tool at ncvoter.org that creates your sample ballot specific to your county with your races all the way down the ballot. I know we talked to Caitlin earlier in another episode, and she said that her ballot is 3 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of races that we are voting for. So be sure you're taking the time to look up what those ballots and to look up the races on the ballots, so you can be informed. You can make an informed decision about whoever you're choosing, but you at least know what they do. Like, what does Waste Management do? What does our North Carolina State Supreme Court do? Amongst, of course, the presidential and top-up ticket. I'm your host, Joselle Torres. Be sure to check out our page for all of our other great episodes. Tune into our podcast, Built by Us, and we will see you again soon. Bye.